Why we're here. Tonight's program, Secret Societies of Detroit from the History Press. This book tells the story of secret societies that have operated in Detroit for most of the city's history. Many were formed for amusement and companionship, while others were much more serious in mind, had more serious ends in mind, and Grosse Pointers have been members of many of these organizations. Bill Loomis, our speaker tonight, is a previous Bicknell lecturer on October 2nd, 2013, he presented his book, Detroit's Delectable Past, 2 Centuries of Frog Legs, Pigeon Pie, and Drugstore Whiskey, and talked about some of the roadhouses here in Grosse Pointe. And he has copies of that book and the new book, or the book we're talking about tonight, to autograph. Nobody can leave without buying a copy of this book. Which included anyway, Mr. Loomis, a freelance writer, possesses a degree in comparative literature from the University of Michigan, has done graduate work in television production at New York University. He's had articles published in the New York Times, Quality Magazine, and a variety of business, academic journals, Michigan History Magazine, Detroit Hour, or Hour Detroit, I should say, Crane's Detroit Business, and Detroit News. He also appears regularly on Detroit talk shows and history-based programs like Mysteries at the Museum. Bill Loomis.
Thank you. I have to warn you, this is the first time in about 2 years I've actually talked to a live group. Everything has been Zoom since the pandemic started, and so this is really a nice pleasure. It's not much fun talking to a screen and nobody responds to anything you say, so that's good, but I may be a little bit rusty, but anyway, again, thanks for coming. This is a topic that I started looking into back in 2014. I had a friend, I was touring through downtown, I was talking about the buildings, and she said, well, that's an odd building. It was a big white building, it says Moose at the top of the building. It's owned by the Illiches. And I said, yeah, that was the old Moose headquarters. And she goes, you know, what was that? So she knew nothing about it at all. And so I started looking into it. And the amount of material was just enormous. Even the newspapers ran columns about going-ons in the club, you know, what club news and all this kind of thing. And so I wrote the article for the news, and there was quite a positive response. A lot of people were very interested in it. But as I was writing it, I was coming across different types of groups. The article is really about fraternal organizations, the groups that were most popular in the early 20th century and the late Victorian period. But there were also religious groups and political groups and many other serious groups. And so that's when I thought, well, maybe it should be a book. So that's when I started collecting more and more material. But in sort of an overview of this subject, belonging to a club in, say, the turn of the century, up until about 1930, was a big deal. And by the Victorian era, about 1 in 5 adult males were at least in one club, and many of them were in 3, 4, or 5 clubs. If you read obituaries of people at that time, of the men especially, it just lists all these clubs they were part of. There were memberships in the Detroit Freemasons were about 40,000 in 1919, with 60 lodges. So they were sort of the granddaddy of the whole thing. In 1916, Detroit was labeled the #1 destination for conventions to be held in Detroit. So we not only had lots of people involved in clubs, we had people coming in to do their, Yahoo conventions with conga lines and drinking and all that kind of happiness. In 1897, 100,000 Shriners came to Detroit to celebrate their existence, I guess. At the time, in 1897, there were just over 200,000 Detroiters. So you can imagine how wild that must have been. They probably took over everything in the city. And people opened their doors to them and had them stay at their houses and stuff like that. In 1920, 20,000 Freemasons marched down Woodward Avenue for the laying of the foundation stone for their temple, new temple, which is on Temple Street, of course. At the time it was Bag Street, I believe. In 1950, the Detroit City Women's Club was the largest in the United States, the largest women's club in the United States. And they had that beautiful building, also owned by the Illiches, which is, I think, on Clifford Street. It's just a really stunning place with Flavic tiles all over. And there's a lot of history in this city with clubs. Now, I'd like to add, why do people join clubs? What was this drive to join these clubs? But you have to understand, I mean, in the Victorian days, before telephones, the only way you could talk or communicate with people was either in person or through a letter. And they wrote lots of letters. I've read a lot of letters from those times, and they wrote nearly every day, but they still needed companionship. And when you were alone, there was no distractions. You were there, and nature was there, and that was about the whole story. So there was a need for friendship. There was no doubt about that. People joined clubs to make friends. Clubs were a good source for business contacts. If you were in a service industry, let's say you sold life insurance or something, it was about one of the best ways to make contacts. People wanted to trust somebody before they would invest in something like that. And the club was a good area to do that. They joined to prevent or to promote something. So a lot of these clubs are based on charity and were driven like the Goodfellows to collect things for children at Christmas. And that was very popular. Some of the clubs were political, and I'll talk about a couple of those tonight. That was always part of it, especially during the Civil War. There were clubs called Dark Lantern societies, and these groups would promote the political end of the Civil War positions. So there was a club that would promote, almost secretly, Abraham Lincoln's popularity among the populace. They were supporters along those lines. People joined clubs for social advancement. It was prestigious. If you were suddenly a member of the Detroit Yacht Club, that meant something. And that it didn't always have to be even that visible. It could be, I'm a member of the Masons now, and that was a big deal. They joined clubs many times just for the benefits. In the old days, many jobs, like being a waiter, there were no benefits. And if you didn't, it was a cash job. And if you didn't go to work that day, you had no money that day. And so clubs like the Maccabees really were formed to provide some kind of health insurance or life insurance or a retirement fund for a lot of these people that had none. And then finally, and there's a couple of clubs I'll talk about today, people join clubs out of fear and envy and sometimes hatred, based on religious hatred sometimes or racial problems, and they formed these clubs to protect themselves usually. They felt like they were being threatened, their existence was in question, and it's not too distant from what we're seeing today, these days, on the national news about some clubs. They really are extremist in a lot of their views. The first club I want to talk about was probably the blueprint for many, many clubs thereafter, the Freemasons. They trace their lineage all the way back, really, to the medieval days. They have documents from 1300s, and of course the Masons were the people, the men who were the stonemasons for the cathedrals that were being built, the nunneries, any church building of any structure, they were done by the Masons. And they were very popular in the United States as well. The Masons, George Washington was a master Mason. A lot of the 21 signers of the U.S. Constitution were Masons. and 14 presidents have been Masons. It's Gerald Ford was the last Mason, I think, to be president, actually. So it's the language of the Constitution, and I don't know this personally, but is said to be very similar to the language of the Masonic organization. They use the same terminology and things like that. So it's always been a big deal. In Detroit, in the French period, some of the leaders did feel that they were Masons, but there was no lodge. And it wasn't until after the English took over Detroit from the French in 1760, about 4 years after that, the first lodge was formed by a fellow named John Christie. He was a British soldier, actually American, who fought for the British. And they named the lodge Zion Lodge Number 10. They were said to be the first Masonic lodge west of the Alleghenies. And they would have meetings in the fort, in the guardhouses of the fort. It grew, it was popular. They had, within the next 20 years, it had grown to 4 lodges. There weren't that many people in the fort, so membership was probably pretty limited. But it was still an active activity for these men. This is actually an image from a painting that's at the Bicknell Library at the University of Michigan. The Masons were major donors to the university to provide seed money to start the University of Michigan. They provided the majority of the money themselves.
In Detroit, that time, right?
Yeah, it wasn't in Ann Arbor, it was in Detroit, downtown. And they raised $3,100, which in those days, 1817 was big money, considering. So they were important back then. In 1851, they built their first brick temple on Griswold and Shelby. And then in 1870, they were growing just as the city was growing. 1876, they built another temple that was a little bit bigger. And then by 1893, they built what the Free Press called a huge temple. It was 6 stories tall, and thought, oh, this will be it for the rest of our lives. We'll never build another temple. Well, by 1919, they had way outgrown it. They couldn't get everybody in there. So they started holding meetings at the Detroit Athletic Club and began planning for this massive new temple that they wanted to build. They didn't want to use borrowed bank loans or mortgage to pay for the thing, so they went directly to members and asked for donations to build up the funds to build this temple. They raised $2 million that way, and money was coming in, still coming in, and finally it ended up they had nearly $4 million, and it was coming in from all over the country to build a temple. They had enough money, though, at that time, and they hired a nationally famous architect, George D. Mason, to design the new temple. And on Thanksgiving Day in 1920, they had the groundbreaking ceremony. Warren G. Harding, the president, was here to speak. They used George Washington's original trowel, which was symbolic trowel, which he used to set the stone for the American U.S. Capitol building. But they had that trowel, and they used that for the Detroit building as part of this symbolism. And there it is. At the time it was built, yes, did you have a question?
Yeah, this fall, that trial is coming back to Detroit.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's
For that, because that took a couple of years to build that temple.
yes.
And, yeah, it's coming back in the fall.
Oh, that's
Research
interesting.
is coming.
Are they going to put it on display or something?
I don't know, his Bible was coming through the lodges for a while.
Oh, really?
About that thing.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that's very
But
cool.
what's interesting about that building is there's 1,100 rooms in that building.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Detroit Zion 10, now it's number 1. I'm a member of number 1.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the original charter.
Mhm.
So what's interesting about that building is it's shaped like a gavel.
Yes,
Look at it.
yes, right.
The gavel that's used when you're meeting.
Uh-huh.
And that was the idea part of behind it. But it's a fascinating building. And one thing I would mention to anyone that's here is on the third floor is a nice temple chapel. Which
Okay,
is fascinating.
yes.
I mean, you can see the Knights of Armor, you can see the balconies, the flags.
Mhm.
And then we have artifacts from the Holy Land that were brought here.
Oh, very interesting.
Oh, yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, churches were set up like crosses, right? I mean, that was the general structure, so that follows that a little bit.
Yeah, when you go in the chapel, there's a gold cross that hangs up at 90 feet. It's huge.
Oh, yeah.
It's fascinating.
Well, Corrado Perducci was the architectural
Yes,
artist.
yeah, the
designer.
same, yeah.
Lived in Grosse Pointe Shores.
Yeah, that's
That's
right.
last one.
That's right.
So, I not just I want to tell you a quick story.
Yeah.
So, in the Scottish Rite part of the building,
Mhm.
you have the York Rite, the Scottish Rite. I was looking at something, and said, this doesn't make sense to me. And it had Ulysses S. Grant in a painting. It was a big painting,
Uh-huh.
but it was dark, like cigar smoke.
Oh, yeah.
That was it. So I contacted this gentleman who was a professor in St. Louis. I said, I've got a picture of something here. I think you need to see it. And I said, Ulysses S. Grant was a Freemason. Why is this here?
Mhm.
I'm not kidding. The guy called me at work as soon as he got my message. He goes, where is this?
Hmm.
He said, only 2 paintings are like this, and one of them is at the Smithsonian. Why do you have this? We don't know where it came from. So they made an exact duplicate of the painting,
Uh-huh.
and then we gave them, I forgot where it went. Yeah, this has got a lot of different tracks.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's good. Well, moving on, this is a group with a totally different operation and totally different philosophy. They're called the KnowNothings. And they were really the start of these rock'em sock'em politics of the days, in the pre-Civil War days. The KnowNothings came at a time when immigration up until to the United States, up until 1830, was relatively small. It was 10,000 people were coming a year, and the population was 12 million, so people had made no notice of that. By 1840, it had risen to 3% now of Americans were immigrants, 3%. And so they was on the radar, but still nobody was too worried about that. But by 1840 to 1850, 1.7 million immigrants had come to the United States.
Is that the potato famine, was that going on there?
Potatoes Santa Ana was 1847, I think, so yes, very likely.
Does that exclude the British immigrants?
What's that?
The British immigrants?
Did it include them?
Yeah.
Well, it was all immigrants, but it was primarily Irish and German immigrants. That was really what the big bulk was. And by 1850, nearly 10% of Americans were immigrants. So people, the figure that alarmed them was three-fifths of those 10% of the people were Catholics. And that was making people very edgy. They didn't like that. If you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, that's what this was all about. These were slum neighborhoods in lower Manhattan, and half were Irish and half were established Americans, or what they used to call nativists, and they would fight tooth and nail. I mean, they really fought. The KnowNothings arose from the dissolving of the Whig Party. The Whigs were the conservatives, and they were not doing well, and they eventually disbanded. But some of the Whigs were extremely conservative and militantly conservative, and they formed this new party, which they called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. They were not too subtle. But it was known in the press as the Know Nothing Party, because they would do all these shenanigans, and they'd say, well, we know nothing about that. And so it fit. The Know-Nothings began, like I said, in the slums of New York in the 1850s, and they would ram their candidates through, and they'd stuff ballots, and they would use extreme violence to win whatever they could in elections. And their general slogan was, "Catholics are not entitled to toleration." So there wasn't a lot of movement there. This was this fellow was one of their symbols. He was called a citizen know nothing, and it was the rise of a movement called Nativism. And Nativism was you were born in America, and your parents were both born in America. And if that wasn't the case, you didn't cut it, you were out. So it was a very, very narrow group. This is the real, I don't know if you ever saw the movie, but there was a character in the movie called Bill the Butcher, and he wore a top hat, and he was a totally evil guy. This was the actual Bill the Butcher. He still wears a top hat, and here he's holding his butcher saw, I guess it is, a bone saw. And they, again, just seemed to thrive on violent activity. They just constantly were causing trouble. The thing that puzzled me was, okay, I can understand in New York City, while there'd be guys fighting for street control and, you know, it's very intensely, but why would somebody in Saginaw care about something? There's nothing but open land in Kalamazoo and in the rural areas of Michigan. Who cares? There's plenty of room. Well, what you find out is at the time there were documents circling around London and Ireland about what to do about the peasants. And they would sometimes get over to America, and these people would read these documents. And the one document was called A Proposed Plan of General Emigration. And the plan was to send Irish peasants to the U.S., to send away undesirable peasants, and to make a large region of the United States a Catholic state. People read that and go, oh my God, what's going on here? You know, this isn't a plot. We're a Protestant nation. So this got people in the rural areas very fired up about it. So the Know-Nothings came to Michigan in the 1850s, early 1850s, and they started in Kalamazoo, and they started working on small town politics. They would, you know, do their thing to push their candidates through and shout people down and all that kind of stuff. And they eventually got to Detroit, and in 1855, and promoted this fellow, Henry Porter Baldwin. He was run as the know-nothing candidate in Detroit for mayor. He lost, but they did get a couple people on the city council, but he lost. And later, he rejected the know-nothing party and ran as governor, and he won and was considered a really good governor. So that worked out well. But the know-nothings began to disappear. I have a feeling that you know, intense anger and fear is a hard thing to maintain for decades. You can do it for a while, but it doesn't. You can't just keep doing it forever and ever. And what happened was, here's the quote from the Detroit Free Press: "Riots and street fights, broken heads, and black eyes have been among minor trophies of this institution." So that's exactly what they were doing all the time. But the know-nothings dissolved at the start of the Republican Party in the 1850s, and the concern that people were no longer concerned about Catholics and now focused on slavery and the South, and so that led into something even worse, but the Civil War. But they at least stopped existing. This is another very interesting group that was in Detroit. They were Confederate spy ring. And there were Confederate spies in Detroit, and they came down from Canada. The reason why there were spies was that the Confederate vision of the United States was a lot different than the United States version of the United States. They saw the Yankees, if you will, in a smaller portion up to the northeast, as we know. The Confederate States in this map is huge, And then they had something they called the Northwestern Confederacy, which was the Midwest, in which Michigan was part of that. And in their view, they said that they felt that the Northwestern Confederacy, the Midwest, wasn't as committed or fanatic about Abraham Lincoln. They weren't like the Yankees and like the New England people. They also believed because the Northwestern Confederacy, if you will, was a lot of farms and almost all farmers. The people that bought their produce were from the South. They didn't ship any produce to the East Coast. It all came down to Mississippi and stuff. And because of that, they felt that if morale was changed a bit, if the morale started to slip in the North, they would abandon the Americans and join the Confederacy. They firmly believed that this would happen. So that meant that their goal of these spy groups were to somehow undermine morale in the North. If they could do that, then they could convince people to leave the U.S. So the Confederates had a spy network in Toronto. It was British, and the British were sympathetic to the South. And so they maintained a fellow named Jacob Thompson was the head of the spy ring in Toronto. And the plan was they wanted to burn down Detroit. That was their goal. So they gathered, he hired this man, John Yates Bel, who was a Confederate, had been a Confederate officer. He was 31 years old, a Southern aristocrat. He was a graduate of the University of Virginia. He fought for Stonewall Jackson, but he was severely wounded and he couldn't fight anymore. So they said, "Do you want to be a spy?" And he said, "Yeah, that sounds great." So he was. And they asked him to come down. So he organized this group that was in Windsor. They stayed at the Castle Hotel, and they planned out how they were going to burn down Detroit. And what they would do was they would come over to Detroit and they would sort of lay out their plan. They were going to start a fire on the old Gratiot Road just outside of Detroit, which would draw the fire department away from the center of the city. And then they were going to stay in the hotels in Detroit and start fires in the rooms, and also set up some bombs on storefronts on the main streets. And also they were going to bomb the train stations. There were 2 train stations. They were going to blow those up. So it was a pretty serious goal. But they met on the day to start laying out the explosives, and one person didn't show up. And John Yates Bel said, "Oh, I know why that happened, because he ratted on us." So they called the whole thing off.
So what year was that?
This was 1863. But they weren't done yet. The guy Thompson, Jacob Thompson, said, "We got to do something." So another problem the Confederacy was having, by 1864, they realized they were running out of men, soldiers and officers. They didn't have enough. And as it turned out, there was a prisoner of war camp in Sandusky, right where the amusement park is. I don't think it was an amusement park, but they had a prison there, Cedar Point, and they had a prison there, and they thought, well, what they wanted to do was raid that prison and break those men free, especially officers. They needed officers, and there were a lot of officers there, and they would get them back to the South to resume fighting. So it was, a pretty bold plan, and they started out doing it, but the one thing that stood in their way was there was a gunboat on the Great Lakes called the USS Michigan, and it protected the Great Lakes, but also especially the Sandusky area from just this sort of thing. Well, Jacob Thompson, the head of the spy ring, he had a spy on the USS Michigan, and his plan, he said, was they were going to drug the officers and the captains during dinner and have them incapacitated. Then Beale would come in and take over the gunboat. And they would sail the gunboat over toward the prisoner of war camp and say, okay, the prisoners go, we're blowing it to bits. So that was the plan. So Bel and his band, he had a band of about 20 soldiers that were armed. They were not in any uniform or anything like that. They got onto a boat called the Philo Parson, which was a passenger boat that took people from Windsor to the islands in Lake Erie, all the little settlements there. So they got onto the boat, and then about halfway down the river toward Lake Erie, he said, we're Confederate officers, we're taking over this boat. And he had all the crew go into the hold, and all the passengers go with them. And they started paddling out, and then the first chance they got, they let the passengers go at one of the ports, and the same with the crew, except for the navigator and the captain. And they started heading toward Sandusky. And they had the meeting, the rendezvous was going to be at 12 midnight. So they're waiting, they got within eyesight of the USS Michigan, and they waited for the signal, which was going to be a lantern swung back and forth. The signal never came. And that was because the captain had been tipped off that there was a spy on the boat, and he had him arrested and locked up. And so that didn't happen. So Bel said, well, we're going to go for it anyway. Well, the crew said, no, we're not. We're not. So they prevented it and forced him to turn around. Well, Bel, in his hubris, as he was coming back into Windsor, going up the river, he had an enormous Confederate flag flying on the Philo Parsons. And they came in, and then when they got to the port, to Windsor, they just totally vandalized the boat and shot holes in the floor to sink it. And all the men were caught except for Bel and Thompson. They got away. Thompson was waiting for them there. They escaped, and they went out to New York. And here they were going to do yet another thing. They were going to derail a train, a passenger train, along the Niagara River. And he got recognized before this actually happened by a policeman, Bel did, and they took him away and they took him to prison, and he was hung. He was only the second person hung by the Army in U.S. history. The first person was Major John Andre, who was hung by George Washington. So they were pretty bad guys. Everybody knows about the Underground Railroad. That was a big deal in Detroit, and that happened just before the Civil War was going on. But the image of the image, I should say, or the reality of the Underground Railroad was that there would be people that go down to the south. They would pick up fugitive slaves. They were called conductors, I believe, and they would bring them back, and they would stay at different, what were called stations that were run by white Quaker religious people, and they would hide in barns or in basements and things like that until they got to Michigan and to Ypsilanti and Detroit and would go over. But not all of the organizations finding slaves were part of that organization. And there was one fellow named William Lambert who was originally from Trenton, New Jersey. He was raised there, and then as a 13-year-old, he came to the Great Lakes and was a cabin boy on the passenger boats. And he used to stop in Detroit a lot. And by the age of 20, he ended up staying in Detroit. He became a tailor, and he made some pretty good money. He was really pretty well off. But he also saw that as the fugitive slave law was enacted in the 1850s, which was much harsher than it had been previously, they needed help. So he founded a thing called the African Americans Men of Mystery. And what he did was he brought slaves back without using the Underground Railroad stations and that sort of thing. And what he did was he had 3 large drays, large wagons, with false bottoms, which could hold adults underneath, up to 4 of them. And he would then take them up the small country roads from the south through the western part of the U.S., like Missouri and then over toward Michigan, and up from Kalamazoo across over to Ypsilanti into Detroit. And it was said they brought back 40,000 people this way over the years, over many years. He had help from another friend. I do have this slide. Let's see if it comes up. It's not working. There it is. This was another man who helped him. He was formerly the butler for William Henry Harrison. He was quite a distinguished man. And he came to Detroit in 1849 and owned a series of boats, which he made some very good money doing that. And then he used them then to take over people once they were in Wyandotte, and he used them to take people over. But what Lambert and George the Baptiste's organization was really based on the Masons. They had passwords and all the kind of accoutrement that a lot of the Masons had. And Lambert himself was a Mason. So it was an interesting time.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I'm looking at that last name. That's a very common name in New Orleans.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
He was actually from Missouri, too. Yeah, but there's no reason his family, I don't know anything about his ancestors or anything. This is a very different group. This was a religious group. As you can see, they didn't even look.
Okay.
Yeah. The person on the right is a woman. And they were called Disciples of the Flying Roll.
They didn't live with barbers?
Yeah, no, that was one of their tenets. They did not, scissors were man-made, so they couldn't use scissors. They were, this man was actually called Prince Michael, and he was from Canada. His name was Michael Xavier Mills. He was from Elgin, Ontario, and he moved, he was a farmer, and he moved to Sandusky, and then he moved to Port Huron and Lexington, and then he moved to Detroit. And when he was in Detroit, he read a book by a fellow named James Jezreel, and it was based on this religious cult that was in England. It started in the 1760s. There was a woman named Susan Southcott in Devon, England, and she claimed she had 10,000 followers, which sounds pathetically small these days, but when you had no internet or anything, that was a lot of people to follow you. And they believed that to go to heaven, to live a proper religious life and be admitted to heaven, you had to not only follow the scriptures in the New Testament, but you had to follow the laws of the Old Testament. They were called Nazarites. And Nazarites, obviously, did not cut their hair. I'm not sure they combed their hair. They didn't drink alcohol, of course. They didn't, they ate only kosher food. And unfortunately, they didn't believe in marriage either, which was their downfall. It didn't work out well for them on that score.
You didn't have children out of wedlock in those days then, right?
Yeah, right.
So there weren't many descendants.
More of a tribal thing, I guess it was.
See, I was going to say, how long did it last?
Well, yeah.
One generation.
What is a flying roll?
Well, that's a good question. You know, it's not a sushi thing. It's not some kind of food fight. It was, you got to think scroll. And the flying roll was a quote from the book of Zechariah, and in which he had visions of this gigantic roll which had 144,000 names on the roll. There were 12,000 names from all 12 tribes of Israel. This is the Old Testament, okay. So anyway, those were the people on this roll that were going to be admitted to heaven at the end of the earth. The rest of us would suffer a terrible death and extinction. All right, so yeah.
What did we do wrong?
I know. So anyway, Michael Xavier Mills met this fellow James Jezreel, who was head of Joanna Southcott died. The religion split into two sects, and this guy, James Jezreel, started with one sect. He wrote this book about being the sixth messenger of God and who's bringing all this news to us. And Michael Xavier Mills was so entranced with this, or so obsessed with it, he said, I want to sell these books. So he went door to door selling Jezreel's books for 3 years. And after 3 years of this, he decided, I'm the seventh messenger of God. I am Prince William, and I'm going to be the last messenger of God. So, and I'm going to be in Detroit, and Detroit's going to be the place of incoming. All the tribes are going to be coming to Detroit. There'll be hundreds of thousands of people. It didn't really work out. But he ended up contacting a lot of these people he'd sold books to, and suddenly there were hundreds of people coming to Detroit. And they would bring sometimes their children, sometimes not. It was all their property, they'd sold that off and they'd give him all his money. And he soon bought houses on Hamlin Street, which was on Bethune now, where Bethune is, just north of the Grand Boulevard. And it was considered outside the city, but they called it the God House. And he had these religious ceremonies at the God House. Everybody stayed in these houses. And everything was kind of going well. The newspaper, the Free Press, called them a brave and open-hearted class of people. They seemed to be okay. But then something hit Prince Michael's wife, his legal wife from Canada, sued him for divorce and said he was cruel to her, he tortured her, and he slept with other women in the sect. Oh, that changed things. And suddenly the newspaper in the court was covering every minute of the trial. And it was really a hot thing to listen to, I guess. It got much worse when he was accused of sleeping with an underage girl. She was 15 years old, and her name was Bernice Bicknell. And she was daughter of two of the sect members, and she played piano during the religious church service. Well, when you think you're a spokesman for God, you don't quite see the world the same way as other people see it. And so he thought he deserved this girl. It was his right. And even her parents said, you should sleep with him because he's God's spokesman. You'll be related to God or something, I don't know. But anyway, the court said, no, this isn't fine. And so he got sent to Jackson State Prison. And that was the end of the sect. But that wasn't the end. It didn't stop there. They reemerged. They reemerged in the 1920s. Only this time, the Prince Michael character was called King David. And he was a former broom salesman in Kentucky. And so his name was Benjamin Franklin Russell. And he started in Benton Harbor. It's odd, but when James Jezreel was doing his missionary work in Michigan, he went to Detroit, he went to Grand Rapids, and he went to Benton Harbor. And so they somehow felt Benton Harbor was going to be the new place to be. So they ended up buying a large mansion in Benton Harbor, they called Shiloh, and then they bought 180 acres next to the mansion, and they started an amusement park. And they would get 600,000 people a summer to come to this amusement park in Benton Harbor. And the amusement park had pony rides, and they had carnival, and they had bowling, and they had all kinds of fun things. Here's the main drag. And Purnell is this fellow on the left with the white hat and the beard. I don't know if you can see that. He's got like a white suit.
Like fourth from the left or fifth from the left? In the front row, right there. He's right there, yeah, right there, yeah.
Yeah, that's the guy. And he was far smarter than Prince Michael. King David was, he had a lot more involved. Because they started businesses, they owned an island where they harvested timber, and it was a going thing. And everything was good again, but again, somebody was accused of having sex with other women in the sect. And this time, this guy was not found guilty. As it turned out, it was believed 2 women whose father had joined the sect sold off all their inheritance and gave it to him, and they were mad. So they accused him of this. But he did die during the process. It was so stressful for him. But the sect continued, and they actually they had a semi-pro baseball team. They had a team, it was funded until 1956. And they would play the Chicago Cubs in the off-season, New York Yankees and things like that. And they were actually asked if they would cut their hair, 2 of them, they could be hired to play pro ball, but they refused. They don't do that, so that was that. They had a band that played, the 1 Cent Band. This was a shot from 1920. The guy that Purnell always believed, for one, he loved baseball, so he kept the team going, but he believed that the young men needed an activities, otherwise they'd drift away from the cult. And so he was always coming up with these ideas for them to do things. And then finally, things faded out, but they kept up, they got rid of the amusement park and they closed all that down, but they kept up the large gardens and orchards, so it's more like a standard monastery where people quietly did work, and they were coming from all over the world to stay in Benton Harbor and do this. They're still seen very positively in Benton Harbor. So that was a very interesting group of people. The next group is much more frightening. This was the Ku Klux Klan in Detroit in the 1920s. This is the Grand Dragon from 1925. But the Klan, the Klan went through 2 phases. The first version of the Klan came right after the Civil War. It was more a ragtag group of sort of people terrorizing black people into not running for politics and not getting any traction in life. That dissolved with the passage of a law in the 1870s that said you can't do that. But in 1915, this fellow, William Joseph Simmons, reformed the Klan, and he based it more on fraternal club models. So they had passwords, they had dues, and they had meetings, they had regular meetings and things like that. And it was spurred on by a popular movie at the time called Birth of a Nation, in which the Klan was a big feature of that. But that was the image where, the first version of the Klan, they didn't have the robes and all that kind of thing. And now they had not only robes, but their horses had robes. And they were into all this ceremony and color, all this kind of thing. They were obviously originally in the South, but eventually they moved up north. And the attraction for people in the North for the Klan was mainly rural. It was all these small towns. And it was felt at the start of Prohibition that Detroit was not administering the laws of Prohibition. There were speakeasies everywhere, there was illegal booze, it was just out of control. And a lot of the preachers in small towns said, they're breaking the law. And the people that are doing it are from Europe, they're Catholics, they're Polish and they're Germans, and they're having Yahoo times in taverns, and they just ignore everything, and their kids are being taught their original language by Catholic nuns. And they're not real Americans. So that was considered they needed help. And the Klan was around, so he was saying, we're going to enforce these laws. We're going to be the police. The police don't care. So they had a lot of these raisings and meetings in rural areas. Dearborn was a really big part of the Klan. The Klan came to Detroit a little bit later. They were in Detroit in 1921, and they sent a recruiter who had an office in Detroit, and he took out full-page ads in the newspapers that's, were saying, we're looking for people to join, only real American men can join, no others need apply. And so he was pretty successful. We started out, they had 3,000 men that had joined the Klan. But in just a few years later, in the fall of by 2023, they had 30,000 men. It was a huge influx of people. And the original focus, of course, was Catholics. They were worried that Catholics were taking over and not becoming real Americans. They were not following rules, if you will. But that switched over at the start of the Great Migration of black people coming up from the rural South. Suddenly, black people were a big problem. And so that's where that change came in. The Klan in the 1920s actually ran this candidate, Charles Bowles, in 1924 for mayor. And there was just a panic in the city to think that a major city like Detroit might elect a Ku Klux Klan person to become mayor. It was just unthinkable almost. He ran against John Smith, who was a Catholic, and was campaigning hard in cities like Hamtramck, where the Klan was raiding blind pigs and taverns and closing things down, and really attacking a lot of Polish people. So what he did was he ran as a write-in candidate, and he would have been elected, but this probably sounds familiar. The people that worked for John Smith's campaign inspected the ballots and said, well, they misspelled his name wrong, and so it's not valid. So they're just like, that's not valid, that's not valid. So they did away with 15,000 ballots that way. It was the biggest election in Detroit's history up until then. So there 300,000 people voted. So it was a big deal. And but the Klan, so he was not elected. But there were some city council members elected. And the Klan began focusing more on people who were leaving the restricted, segregated neighborhoods, black neighborhoods like Paradise Valley or Black Bottom. And they were focusing on those people like Ossian Smith, Dr. Ossian Smith, who was being attacked by mobs outside his house. And that story was that one of the family members shot a rifle and killed one of the rioters who were throwing stones. And so it went to trial, and the whole family was at trial for murder. And he was acquitted, and the family was acquitted. But the Klan was involved with a lot of these things. But the Klan really started to die out soon after that. Again, by 1920, they didn't last that long. By 1928, they were down to a few hundred members. And by 1941, they pulled up stakes and said, okay, we're no longer here. So, again, I think some of these really angry groups don't really have good staying power.
How does it connect with I always heard Howell was the big bastion area.
Yeah, there was a lot going on in Howell, but there were a lot of the rural Michigan cities had Klan
Their own
roots. Yeah, had their own roots.
The Grand Blizzard in Howell?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
I think they're still there.
I think Michigan had more Klan members than any state in the South. So it was pretty seriously committed. The last group I'm going to talk about tonight are the Nazi spies that were in Detroit. I don't know if you know this figure. His name is Max Stephan, and he was in the middle of a lot of this stuff. But Nazis in the 1930s, the FBI had approximately they had 832 agents, and they were focused on catching rum runners and gangsters and all that kind of stuff that wrote federal laws. But by 1939, as at the end of the 30s, they had over 4,000 officers, and they were now focused as the armaments and the factories were converting to war materials. the Nazis were much more interested in what was going on here, and so they had spies throughout Detroit inspecting and giving reports back on what these different factories were doing. And the FBI was focused on a lot of this activity. Detroit also had an enormous German population all through the eastern side of the boulevard and all the way to Grosse Pointe, really, was a lot of Germans. So they were really concerned with this. And there was a man who, this Max Stephan, he fought in World War I for Germany. At the end of World War I, he became a prison guard, and then he was a policeman, and he was just kind of drifting around. But he decided he and his wife would immigrate to Canada. And this was in the 30s during the Prohibition, near the end of Prohibition. But they opened a bar, a saloon in Windsor. His wife opened the brothel upstairs. They were a nice couple. But they had this activity going, and not soon afterward, he decided he needed to become an American citizen. So he got illegal papers, and he filed, and he became an American citizen. And he moved to Detroit, and he opened a restaurant on East Grand Boulevard in Jefferson. It was a German restaurant, and but the restaurant was a little unusual, and it had a large hall, open space behind it. And it was here that at midnight they would gather, some Germans would meet there and have Nazi rallies, Bund rallies. And there were secret meetings and all that sort of thing. But one of the things this guy Max Stephan did was he would get names of prisoners of war Germans who were sent to Canada. And he would have ladies in Detroit, German ladies, make them gift boxes or sort of first aid boxes, and he would send them toiletries and food sometimes, and put them in boxes and send them up to a prisoner of war camp that was in Bowmanville outside of Toronto. One of those prisoners was this fellow, Lieutenant Hans-Peter Crook. He was this dashing 20-year-old German Air Force pilot, and he fought in the Battle of Britain and was shot down. He survived. He ended up with a bad eye and a smashed hand, but he survived. He convalesced in London. And then when he was healthy again, they sent him to Toronto, to Bowmanville. And there he was held as prisoner. But he felt that it was his duty as a German officer to try to escape. He had to always keep trying. So he escaped out of the prison and walked to Windsor from Toronto, and then got at night, in the middle of the night, he found a rowboat along the lake shore, and he paddled across the Detroit River and got on the Belle Isle, and then as the dawn was rising, he walked across the bridge of Belle Isle and started walking east. And the reason he did this was he had received a box from a German lady Margarita Bertel, and he had her address. So he said, okay, I'm going to go see her. So he started walking, and they were on almost all the way to Alder Road. She lived with her husband and their little child. And Alder Road? Yeah. And
Where Grosse Pointe?
Yeah.
And so on a Saturday morning, she was home alone, and she hears a knock on the kitchen door. And there's a young man standing there completely dirty and ragged looking, and said, I'm from Bowmanville, Canada. And he showed her the epaulets from his officer's uniform, and she knew right away what was going on. And so she led him in the house. He didn't say anything. He sat at the kitchen table, and she was panicked. She didn't know what to do. So he wouldn't talk to her. And so she called Max Stephan, and good old Max came rolling up and went into the kitchen and sat down with this fellow at the table and said, okay, I'll help you. So he immediately took him down to his restaurant and he fed him. And then he took him to get some clothes at the clothing store. Then he took him out for drinks, And then he took her to a prostitute, which Krug said it was crude. It was a stupid thing to do. And so Max Stephan says, yeah, I guess it was. But he said the man was 2 years without a woman in prison. I thought maybe he would like that, but I guess wrong. Anyway, he then took him to different people he knew. He was kind of like parading him around. He was like this prize guy. And so he took him to a fellow named Theodore Donnay. And Donnay was a World War I veteran who even had a saber scar on his cheek. He was really he was a pro Adolf Hitler Nazi guy all the way. And so Donnay listened to the guy's story and he gave him $50. And then Max Stephan took him to a hotel, took Krug to a hotel to spend the night, and he drove off and told me he'd pick him up in the morning. Donnay's clerk had listened to this, and Donnay's clerk, Dietrich Riptlein, called the FBI. So Stephan, in the morning, came to the hotel. He picked up Krug, who was planning to go to Chicago. He had another woman's name in Chicago. And his plan was to travel around the United States and get information, all the information he could on armament plants and on army bases, and then go down to the south, down to Mexico, which was neutral during World War I, too, and then go to the German embassy, and then go home and start fighting again. So he got to San Antonio, but the FBI had already put posters of him all over the place. And he was staying in a hotel, and he called the clerk in his thick German accent and said, I need a wake-up call at 7 p.m. or 7 a.m. And the clerk went, And so he called the police, and the police arrested him, and they sent him back to Detroit. So, in the meantime, also, Max Stephan was arrested by the FBI, first for harboring an alien, and then for treason. And even Margarita Bertel, the lady who he visited, she was arrested for harboring an alien. So Max Stephan's trial began in June 29th, 1942. He faced the trial. And the prosecution had a solid case. His was not good. The FBI had all the information about his illegal papers, becoming an American citizen, all his Nazi meetings in the back of his restaurant, all that kind of stuff. They had all that. They also had testimony from 20 witnesses, including, they called Hans Krug to testify. And much to Stephan's defense attorney, he said, why is this guy testifying? But he did, and he came into the court dressed in his full dress uniform. He even had knee-high leather boots, and he was the full image, a Nazi officer image. And he came and he sat down in the trial, and he said, this Max Stephan is a fool. I thought all his friends were fools. He paraded me around. I want nothing to do with him. So, Max Stephan's lawyer was flagrant, and Max Stephan was pretty put out. So, the defense lawyer made the case that Stephan was not helping the Nazi army or the German nation. He was just helping a young man who needed help. He was dirty and tired, and he was hurt. So he needed help, so that's what he was doing. Well, the prosecution called him a black-hearted traitor, screamed it at him, and they just said, that's nonsense. He knew exactly what he was doing. And Max Stephan was found guilty. So on August 6th of 1942, he faced his sentencing. And he came in, and they said Max Stephan was told that he was going to be sent to a prison, and then in November, he was going to be hung to death. And Stephan this was the headlines from the Detroit Times. Stephan was absolutely shaking. He couldn't stand. He was so upset. and they had to carry him out. And they took him to a prison they took him to Milan, and he was to be hung in November. This was in August when he got his sentence. He was to be hung in November. He got a new lawyer, and which was good. And he appealed to the Supreme Court 9 times for leniency against Stephan. He was rejected every time. But one of the jurists of the Supreme Court was Frank Murphy, and he appealed directly to Franklin Roosevelt, and he said, "Is there any way you can help this fellow?" And so 9 hours before Stephan was to be hung, the warden came into his cell and said, "You're going to live. The president has pardoned you, and you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, but you're not going to hang." And the logic of Roosevelt or the White House was that just like with murder, treason has different levels of guilt, and that this was too harsh for the kind of involvement that this guy had. So he did live, and he died a little bit later, but in 1990, I read an interview that the Free Press did of Hans-Peter Crook in Germany, and by this time now he was 70, and he's a salesman, steel salesman, and he said that he remembered being in Detroit, but he still had no feelings for Stephan. So, what a guy.
How did he get sent back to the prison anymore?
Well, he did, actually, that's a good question. He did get sent back, and he escaped again. Only this time he did get to Mexico, and this time he did go back to Germany. But by that time, the war was over, so it didn't mean that much. But, so that was that, and that's the end of my presentation.
Very good. Quite a bit different than your previous one. Bill's got books here to sign. Another question beforehand? There's a table at the back, though, if you wouldn't mind, we'll sit you up back there.
Yeah.
If there's no questions, thank you so much. Hope to see you next month.